Sarah Jensen loved her peaceful corner of Oakwood Estates, where her cottage-style home sat protected by a magnificent 100-year-old oak tree. For 15 years, she attended her garden, chatted with neighbors, and occasionally attended HOA meetings only when absolutely necessary. Her property, passed down from her grandmother, represented security and belonging in an increasingly unpredictable world. The neighborhood dynamics shifted dramatically when Martin Davenport purchased the vacant Victorian across the street. He arrived in a sleek black Tesla, designer sunglasses perched on his perfectly groomed hair. Within days, he had invited the entire block to an extravagant housewarming party featuring catered food and a professional bartender mixing signature cocktails. "I believe in building connections," Martin announced, raising his glass as neighbors gathered around his marble kitchen island. "In my previous neighborhood, I served as HOA treasurer and increased property values by 15% in just 18 months. Eleanor Winters, the current HOA president, practically beamed. "Our treasurer just moved to Florida. The position is open if you're interested," Sarah observed from the sidelines, nursing her drink. Something about Martin's calculated charm made her uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. When he approached her later that evening, his smile seemed genuine enough. "Beautiful property you have, Sarah. Those mature trees add so much value." He sipped his drink thoughtfully. "Though I noticed your eastern fence line seems a bit extended. Interesting placement." Sarah's spine tingled with unexpected alarm. "The fence has been there since before I moved in." "Of course." Martin nodded pleasantly. "I'm sure it's nothing. Just an observation from my background in real estate development." His words lingered with Sarah long after the party ended, like the first faint whisper of an approaching storm. The following week, Sarah noticed Martin canvassing the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, engaging neighbors in lengthy conversations. From her kitchen window, she observed him charming Mrs. Abernathy, the 80-year-old widow whose memory wasn't what it used to be. Their conversation ended with Martin taking photos of her property line. Sarah found herself watching his movements more carefully. Martin seemed to spend an unusual amount of time examining property boundaries, taking measurements, and making notes. He'd established a routine of morning jogs that somehow always included pauses near property markers and fence lines. At the monthly book club meeting, conversation inevitably turned to their new neighbor. "Martin offered to help me renegotiate my fence agreement with the Thompsons," Diane mentioned. "He said the current placement might not be legally sound. He's reviewing all the HOA records," Eleanor added proudly. "Says there are numerous discrepancies he's determined to fix. The board voted unanimously to make him treasurer yesterday." "That was quick," Sarah remarked, trying to keep her tone neutral. "He has experience," Eleanor defended. "And honestly, he's the only one who volunteered. You know how hard it is to get people involved." Later that evening, Sarah was tending to her vegetable garden when Martin appeared at her fence line. His smile seemed perfectly calibrated, friendly but professional. "Working late, neighbor?" he called, resting his arms casually on the fence post. "These tomatoes won't plant themselves," Sarah replied, brushing soil from her gloves. "I admire your dedication," Martin said, his eyes scanning her property rather than meeting her gaze. "By the way, I've been appointed treasurer. I'll be reviewing all property records, easements, boundaries, getting everything in proper order." "Sounds ambitious," Sarah commended. "Just doing my part," Martin replied with a modest shrug that somehow didn't reach his eyes. "Community integrity matters, don't you think? Property lines, clear boundaries. They're the foundation of good neighborhoods." As Martin walked away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that his words carried a double meaning. She watched him stride confidently down the street, stopping to make notes about the Johnsons' newly installed sprinkler system. Something about his intense interest in property boundaries felt deliberate, calculated, and increasingly concerning. Sarah returned from her sister's wedding in Arizona to find her world subtly altered. 6 wooden stakes with bright orange flags lined what had always been her eastern property border, cutting nearly 8 feet into her carefully tended perennial garden. A laminated notice hung from each stake. "Property line review in progress. Do not remove." Her immediate calls to the city planning office revealed no scheduled surveys in the neighborhood. When she finally reached Eleanor, the HOA president sounded oddly formal. Martin discovered some irregularities in the subdivision plans. While organizing the HOA records, Eleanor explained hesitantly. "Apparently several properties, including yours, may have boundaries that don't match the official plat maps. The certified letter arrived the next morning, featuring the HOA letterhead and Martin's flowing signature as newly appointed treasurer. Inside, Sarah found photocopies of what appeared to be original subdivision documents showing her property line cutting through what she had always considered her side yard. The board has authorized me to work with affected homeowners on a fair resolution, Martin wrote. We can discuss purchase options for the disputed land at your convenience. That evening, while watering her threatened garden beds, Sarah noticed Martin photographing her property from his upstairs window. When their eyes met, he didn't look away or appear embarrassed. Instead, he smiled and waved, as if his surveillance was perfectly normal. Later, Sarah discovered a newly created neighborhood social media group, where Martin had posted about exciting improvements coming to address long-standing property encroachments. Several neighbors had already commented their support, praising his dedication to improving the community. By midnight, Sarah had pulled out every property document she possessed, spreading them across her dining room table, like puzzle pieces to a mystery she'd never imagined she'd need to solve. Sarah's phone chimed with a text message at 7:30 the next morning. Available to discuss the property line situation today. Coffee at my place, 10 a.m. Martin. The casual tone bothered her, as if they were discussing a borrowed lawnmower rather than a significant portion of her property. She declined politely, citing work commitments. Within minutes, Martin called. Sarah let it go to voicemail. Sarah, Martin Davenport here. I understand you're busy, but this matter requires prompt attention. The board is meeting next week to finalize the boundary restoration plan. As a courtesy, I'm offering affected homeowners first right to purchase the disputed areas before we consider other options. Please contact me by Friday. The implied threat wasn't subtle. Sarah forwarded the voicemail to her personal email for documentation, a habit from her days working in corporate communications. At the local hardware store that afternoon, Sarah ran into Jerry Thompson, whose property backed up to hers. Did you get stakes in your yard too? She asked, noticing his purchase of boundary markers. Jerry nodded grimly. Martin says our back fence encroaches 6 feet onto HOA land. Wants $12,000 to resolve it. He lowered his voice. Barbara down the street got hit with a $20,000 estimate. She's on a fixed income. Nearly had a breakdown over it. Are people actually paying? Sarah asked, stunned. The Wilsons already wrote a check. Jerry confirmed. Martin offered an early resolution discount if they paid within 48 hours. Said it would affect their ability to sell later if they didn't clear up the title issue now. That evening, Sarah noticed unusual activity at Martin's house. A steady stream of neighbors coming and going, each carrying folders. From her kitchen window, she could see Martin seated at his dining room table, displaying documents and gesturing emphatically. Each visitor left looking distressed. The next morning, 4 more stakes appeared, these cutting diagonally across her beloved rose garden. A new notice read, additional encroachment identified, priority resolution required. Sarah's doorbell rang precisely at noon. Martin stood on her porch, holding a leather portfolio and wearing an expression of practiced concern. I thought we should discuss the situation in person, he said smoothly. I brought the historical documents and a reasonable payment plan. The board is quite concerned about your specific case. Why? Sarah asked, not inviting him in. Martin's professional smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Your encroachment is among the most severe. Given your position in the neighborhood, we'd like to resolve yours first as an example to others. I'd like to see the original documents, Sarah replied. Not copies. Of course, Martin nodded. They're safely stored at my home office. I'm hosting information sessions all week. Perhaps you could stop by this evening. Say, 7? As he walked away, Sarah noticed something she'd missed earlier. A small camera mounted under Martin's car side mirror, pointed directly at her property. The tiny red recording light blinked steadily in the afternoon sun. The county records office occupied the basement of a brutalist government building downtown. Sarah took a personal day from her graphic design job to search for answers, waiting impatiently as Leonard, the elderly records clerk, shuffled through ancient file cabinets. Property disputes are more common than you'd think, Leonard mused, placing a folder of certified documents before her. People get mighty passionate about every inch of land. Sarah's original deed matched exactly what she had always understood. Her property extended 27 feet from the center line of her eastern oak tree. The official subdivision plat confirmed the same boundaries established when the neighborhood was developed in 1978. Could these documents have been modified later? Sarah asked, showing Leonard the copies Martin had presented. Leonard's bushy eyebrows rose as he examined them. These aren't our records. See this watermark? County documents don't have this. And this signature here? Thompson wasn't the county surveyor until 1992, but this document is supposedly from 1978. Sarah felt a chill despite the stuffy basement air. Someone altered them. Wouldn't be the first time. Leonard sighed. Actually, a gentleman was in here a few weeks back, requesting all records for Oakwood Estates. Claimed to be working for the tax assessor. Left my assistant a fancy gift basket after she helped him make copies. Sarah scrolled through her phone, finding Martin's professional headshot on his LinkedIn profile. Was this him? Leonard squinted at the screen. That's the fellow. Very interested in historical boundary adjustments. Said something about resolving long-standing errors. On her way home, Sarah stopped by the local coffee shop where her neighbor Delia worked as a manager. As they caught up, Sarah casually mentioned Martin's property line concerns. Delia's expression darkened. That's strange. He told me he was planning to expand his driveway toward your property because the HOA owned that strip of land and had approved his improvement proposal. Sarah's unease crystallized into something more concrete. That evening, she created a private digital folder documenting everything she had learned and sent copies to her personal email, her sister, and her attorney friend from college. Something told her having backup might prove essential in the days ahead. After a restless night's sleep, Sarah decided to do something that felt both necessary and slightly uncomfortable. Research Martin Davenport himself. Her graphic design skills gave her better than average internet search abilities, and by mid-morning, she had compiled a concerning profile. Martin's digital presence was meticulously curated. His LinkedIn profile claimed an impressive career trajectory through prestigious firms, but when Sarah cross-referenced the companies, two had no record of his employment. His claimed Harvard Business School certificate program showed no graduation records in their public alumni database. More telling were the gaps, periods of 6 to 8 months missing from his professional timeline that coincided with his moves between communities. Sarah found old news articles from community papers in Ridgewood and Lakeside, mentioning property disputes and HOA reorganization during those exact timeframes. A call to her college roommate Kate, now a real estate attorney in the neighboring county, yielded valuable advice. This sounds like a sophisticated scam, Kate remarked after hearing the details. Get certified copies of your deed and original plat maps. Document everything he sends you. If he's falsifying land records, that's a felony. Should I confront him? Sarah asked. Not alone, Kate cautioned. You need allies on your HOA board first. And Sarah, be careful. People who manipulate property records aren't above other forms of intimidation. That afternoon, Sarah noticed a moving truck outside Mrs. Abernathy's house. The elderly woman was supervising the loading of her furniture with tears in her eyes. Sarah crossed the street immediately. Mrs. Abernathy, are you moving? Just temporarily, dear, she sniffled. That nice Mr. Davenport explained that my sunroom was built on HOA land. Rather than make me pay for it, he's arranging for me to stay in a senior apartment until it's resolved. Sarah's stomach nodded. Did you consult your own attorney before agreeing to this? Oh, I don't need to. Martin's handling everything. He even has power of attorney to negotiate on my behalf. Such a kind young man to help an old woman with all this complicated business. Sarah watched helplessly as Mrs. Abernathy's treasured antique desk was loaded onto the truck. As she turned to go, she noticed Martin observing from his front porch, champagne flute in hand. When their eyes met, he raised his glass in a mock toast, his smile never reaching his calculating eyes. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled at the community clubhouse, a venue typically reserved for larger events. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early but found the parking lot nearly full. Word had spread about the boundary dispute, drawing almost every homeowner in the subdivision. Martin had transformed the clubhouse into a presentation space, complete with a digital projector displaying a professional-looking slideshow titled Restoring Boundary Integrity in Oakwood Estates. He wore a tailored navy suit that projected authority and competence. Thank you all for coming, Martin began once everyone was seated. As your treasurer, I take the integrity of our community assets very seriously. During my review of historical records, I discovered significant encroachments affecting HOA common areas. The slide showed meticulously prepared graphics highlighting encroachment zones on several properties, with Sarah's highlighted in alarming red. To resolve these issues equitably, Martin continued smoothly. The board proposes allowing affected homeowners to purchase these portions at current market value, with proceeds funding much-needed community improvements. When Eleanor called for questions, Sarah raised her hand immediately. "I visited the county records office yesterday," she stated clearly, opening her folder of certified documents. "The official plat map contradicts everything in your presentation. My property line is exactly where it has always been." Martin's confident smile flickered only momentarily. "With all due respect, Sarah, the documents you found are outdated. Subsequent land transfers modified those boundaries, as my research clearly shows." Sarah projected calm. She didn't entirely feel. "That's interesting, because the county records clerk confirmed your documents show signs of alteration. The surveyor's signature on your evidence belongs to someone who didn't hold that position until 14 years after these maps were supposedly created." A murmur rippled through the audience. Martin's face flushed slightly as he rushed to regain control. "Obviously, there's confusion about the records," he countered. "But consider this. If we resolve these boundaries now through my proposed purchase program, we protect all homeowners from future disputes, while generating over $200,000 for community improvements." Or, Sarah suggested, "we could verify the authentic records before asking homeowners to pay for land they already legally own." Eleanor, visibly uncomfortable, glanced between them. "Perhaps we should form an investigation committee before proceeding with any purchase program." "Absolutely not," Martin snapped, his composed facade cracking. "As treasurer, I've invested considerable resources in developing this solution. Delaying only creates liability for the HOA." Direct Cohen, a retired judge who rarely attended meetings, stood up from the back row. "Point of order. The bylaws specifically allow for the formation of special committees when questions arise about board proposals. I move we create such a committee immediately." The motion passed despite Martin's strenuous objections. As the meeting adjourned, Martin cornered Sarah near the exit. "You're making a serious mistake," he whispered, his charming demeanor completely vanished. "This could have been so simple." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Actually, I think you're the one who made the mistake." The investigation committee moved with surprising efficiency. Direct Cohen, the retired judge, led the group that included Sarah, a real estate attorney named Priya, and Michael, a cybersecurity specialist who worked remotely. They discovered Martin's resume contained creative embellishments. His claimed MBA from Wharton was actually an incomplete online certificate program. His successful real estate development company existed mainly as a professional website with stock photos of properties he'd never developed. More disturbing were the patterns they uncovered when contacting HOAs in communities where Martin had previously lived. In Ridgewood Commons, he had orchestrated a similar boundary correction scheme that netted over $175,000 from homeowners before a surveyor exposed the fraudulent documentation. In Lakeside Village, he had convinced the HOA to purchase critically needed common areas that were actually unbuildable wetlands he had quietly acquired through a shell company. He creates legitimate-looking paper trails by combining actual documents with forgeries, Priya explained during their third meeting. He's careful to target properties with solo owners, especially women and elderly residents, who might be intimidated by official-looking documents. Michael's digital investigation proved most damning. By examining metadata from Martin's presentation files, they discovered he had created a company called Community Boundary Solutions, LLC, just 2 weeks before moving to Oakwood Estates. The purchase agreements he prepared would have directed payments to this LLC, not the HOA account. Michael explained, showing them the fine print in Martin's contracts. There's also a non-disclosure clause preventing homeowners from discussing the terms. The document expert they consulted confirmed what Leonard at the county office had suspected. Martin had digitally altered legitimate subdivision maps, carefully aging the forgeries to appear authentic. When they presented their findings to the full HOA board, Martin initially attempted to discredit their investigation. When confronted with the forensic evidence of document tampering, his strategy shifted to claiming misunderstanding rather than malice. "I may have been overzealous in my interpretation of certain documents," he conceded, straightening his silk tie. "My intentions were to benefit the community. by charging homeowners thousands for land they already own, Sarah questioned, and directing payments to your personal LLC instead of the HOA. The board voted unanimously to remove Martin from his position and refer the evidence to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. As Martin stormed out of the meeting, Sarah noticed something she hadn't expected to feel. Not just relief, but a sense of community solidarity that had been missing from Oakwood Estates for years. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page. HOA treasurer charged in sophisticated property scheme. The investigation expanded rapidly as other victims from previous communities came forward. Prosecutors uncovered similar attempts in 3 different states, spanning nearly a decade. Martin eventually accepted a plea deal on multiple fraud charges, rather than face trial. The judge, unimpressed by his explanations, ordered full restitution to previous victims, substantial fines, and 3 years of probation with community service. His real estate license was permanently revoked. For Sarah and her neighbors, the experience transformed their previously distant community. Regular gatherings replaced formal HOA meetings. Property records were digitized and made accessible to all residents. Most importantly, they established a system requiring multiple board members to review and verify any property or financial decisions. The irony, Sarah remarked to Eleanor during the community garden planting day established where her disputed property line had been, is that Martin actually did increase our property values, just not how he intended. How so? Eleanor asked, pressing tomato seedlings into the rich soil. Trust adds value, Sarah explained. Now we have transparently governed public records, proper checks and balances, and actual connections with our neighbors instead of just living beside each other. The following spring, Sarah was elected HOA president, running on a platform of transparency and community engagement. Her first official act was establishing a neighborhood education fund using donations that poured in after their story gained national attention. Martin's house remained vacant for months before a young family purchased it at significantly below market value. The parents were both attorneys specializing in consumer protection law. They joined the monthly community dinners Sarah had established, bringing homemade desserts and stories that had nothing to do with property lines. Sarah often reflected on how differently things might have unfolded had she not trusted her instincts and pursued the truth. The oak tree that had been her boundary marker continued to flourish, its branches extending protectively over both her garden and the new community space beyond, a living testament to putting down roots worth defending. In neighborhood lore, the scandal became known simply as the Davenport Affair, a cautionary tale about vigilance and community resilience. Yet its lasting legacy wasn't the attempted theft, but rather what the neighborhood built in its aftermath. Genuine connections that no property line could divide and no con artist, however charming, could breach.